What is that? It's yellow, whatever it was. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Motley Stew Show, where we take one of the bigger stories out of news and politics each week, try to step outside the echo chamber and see why we should really care about this particular story. Now last week we saw the really horrible, tragic shooting in Oregon at one of the community colleges. And as always, that brings about whole new calls about gun control. And it brings about whole new arguments from people like the NRA about why there shouldn't be gun control. And there's study after study after study pointing both sides to be right. And it can be done all the time with pretty much any topic you want, because data can be spun. Depending on who looks at that data, they can find pretty much anything they want. Now, recently in one of my vlogs, I mentioned the fact that after this shooting, I was really hoping that no one was going to rush to create new laws to try to stop things like this, because there is no one single law that's going to stop every single tragedy. There's no one single piece of legislation that's going to eradicate every mass shooting. Someone will always find a way to get a gun legally and then at some point choose to do something really terrible with it. But that's not to say that we can't stem that tide, that we can't take those numbers down from such an astronomically ridiculous level in comparison with other westernized countries. So on the Republican side, you were not going to hear anything about new gun control legislation. And in fact, if anything, they would try to expand gun ownership and gun rights. But on the Democrat side, yes, that's usually a side of gun control. And as expected, one of the frontrunners, depending on which poll you're looking at, Hillary Clinton, did come out with gun control legislation, a proposal for if she becomes president on the way that she would tackle this particular subject. But in the battle of optics and the battle of trigger terms, gun control is a terrible one. When polled with just that term, gun control does really terribly with the majority of the public. But if you actually look at the things underneath most of those packaged legislations, those polled on their own without the banner of gun control, or with even the other particular issues, they usually poll very well. Many of them get over a majority, and some of them get an overwhelming majority of the country on board with those things. But when they're packaged all together, they usually lose their significance and their support inside of the chaos in the echo chamber about this big, overbearing piece of legislation. So before you start freaking out about Hillary Clinton's big idea of taking everybody's guns away, let's actually look at what's in her proposal. Now, the first thing she mentions in that proposal is comprehensive background checks. Now, some gun rights advocates might say that's already in place, we just need to enforce it better. But that's not exactly true. It is true on some parts, but not all. There's still a lot of loopholes in the background check system. The federal background check law doesn't cover gun shows, it doesn't cover unlicensed online transfers, and it doesn't cover anonymous person-to-person sales. Now, of course, that last one you might say, well, nothing is going to cover an anonymous person-to-person sale. True, but if a sale like that was to be found out, the people involved in that sale could not be charged with any sort of extra crime at this point. But if passed, they could. And that's really where that part comes in. But the gun show and the online transfer of weapons is a huge market, and that could do a lot to stem the flow of guns coming into people's hands who knew if they went to a licensed gun store they would not be approved. Now, just to show that this is actually something that is effective, since 1993, when the Brady Bill was passed and the background checks were put in place, even at the status that they're at now, there were over 2.4 million purchases that were blocked because of background checks. 1 million of those were from convicted felons who were trying to buy guns at gun stores. So just take that into consideration. 1 million extra guns to convicted felons had been stopped. And like I said before, when you take things one by one, they have a whole different sense in their polling. And background checks, universal background checks, have a 90% approval rate when polled with the public, and that includes NRA members. The people in the NRA that don't like that is the NRA leadership, Wayne LaPierre and people up at that level. It is not the members. The members are all for it. But Wayne LaPierre just sees this as the beginning of some sort of Pandora's box that if they accept that, it's going to come down with a whole bunch of other gun control legislation, and people will then be taking their guns, taking their ammo, and just running roughshod over the Second Amendment. And included in the background check legislation is also the closure of what's called the Charleston loophole. loophole. And it's called that because they think the shooter, Dylan Roof, who shot those people inside of the church, they think this is how he got at least one of his guns, which is if you go into a gun store and they run a background check on you, if that background check does not return any information, positive or negative, in 3 days, the sale is allowed to go through. Now, I don't know exactly why that's the case. It's not like even the system came back and said, I don't know. It just hadn't gotten back to them, and they say, well, you've waited 72 hours. It doesn't matter anymore if you're a convicted killer. Take the gun. And it turns out that Roof had a federal record. He would have been denied, but for some reason the background check system didn't spit that flag back immediately, which of course goes to say that the background check system should be enhanced and should be fixed to be much more instantaneous. The next point Clinton makes is she wants to repeal the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act. And what this act does, it protects gun stores from liability if those guns purchased at those stores is then caught used in a violent act. And of course you might say logically, that's crazy. You can't blame every single gun store for every single gun used in a crime. That's ridiculous. Guns are going to be used in crimes all the time. This isn't pointed at every single gun store. This is pointed at gun stores who go through loopholes. The ones that don't actually follow the federal background check system, the ones that are shown to be negligent in their duties about making sure the person they're selling the gun to is not someone that shouldn't be getting it. So if those people who are negligent sell a gun to somebody and then that gun is then used in a crime, right now that gun store can't be held liable for the fact that they gave him the gun. Clinton wants to take that away. And continuing in that same idea, she wants to shut down bad actor gun dealers, because she says, and it is totally true, that many, an overwhelming majority of gun dealers are perfectly lawful stores. They're perfectly legal and they follow all the rules, and these establishments are getting an absolutely terrible name from a few stores that are known to not follow the rules, and that's where all these people are going to get their gun. They know that if they go to this gun store down the street, that they're going to run the background check, they're going to wait for the answer, and they're going to find out that this person should not get a gun. But they know that this gun store, maybe 20 miles away, is not going to run the background check successfully. They're going to do just the bare minimum, and they're probably going to slide something under the table, and next thing you know, boom, they have a gun. But like we said, those stores don't get penalized for doing that, and they're allowed to stay open and basically continue doing what they're doing. She wants to be able to shut those stores down. I've actually spoken with an NRA member about these specific things, and for 90% of the ones, he totally agreed with them. And I'll tell you later on which one he disagreed with. Next on the list is banning all domestic abusers who have been convicted from purchasing guns, period. Now right now that is actually in place for married relationships, but it is not in place for people who are in dating relationships or people who are stalkers, because there is no relationship. If you were convicted of stalking a particular person, or you're convicted of beating up your partner in a dating relationship, that does not hinder you from getting a gun. But since we know that there's such an overwhelming amount of these gun violent deaths that are used in romantic relationships where people are personally involved with the person that they're killing, the more we can do to stop the aggravated party in that relationship from being able to get a gun, the less of those we're going to see. Next is increasing the penalty for what are called straw purchases. This means someone who doesn't have any sort of record, someone who can totally very easily purchase a legal gun, going into a store, buying that gun, and then selling it personally, or just even giving it to someone they know who could not pass the background check. Again, overwhelmingly approved by many, many people, including NRA members. Because these are the kind of actions that make the NRA and the NRA members look bad. They don't need that kind of heat. They don't need that kind of pressure or public perception. Next on the list is closing the loophole in the current gun legislation about people who are involuntarily committed. Now right now, those people are not banned from getting guns, which is weird to say that someone who voluntarily commits themselves into a mental institution can actually be flagged and not given a gun, but someone who's involuntarily committed, who's taken forcefully because they don't think they're crazy but everybody else does, they're allowed to get guns. Clinton wants to close that. And for an example, which I do want to preface saying that one example does not mean a pattern or does not mean a preponderance, but there is one very specific example of the Virginia Tech shooter who fell right through that loophole. Now this last point, this is the one that needs a lot more specificity, doesn't have it on the proposal, and this is the one that's going to be the most pushback, especially from NRA members, including the one that I talked to. Clinton wants to ban military-style assault weapons. There's going to be a lot of discussion about what exactly that means. What weapons are you talking about? What specifications on the weapon are you talking about? How many magazines can it hold? How fast can it fire? How fast can it be reloaded? What kind of stock? What kind of trigger grip? All of those things come into play when you're talking about a specific type of weapon. And I can agree with part of that. I don't think people on the streets need AK-47s or need AR-15s. I don't think semi-automatic semi-automatic weapons are necessary to be in the home. But legislating on that can be really tough. That's where you're going to find the most pushback from the public, because at that point, that's where you're going to fall into the category of taking away guns that people already have, or at least banning the future sales of those guns, which are going to basically just push all those gun sales underground. Now here's the twist of this. Clinton comes out with gun proposal legislation, and she paints herself as going to the left of Bernie Sanders, because although Bernie Sanders is an avowed socialist and he's as left as you're going to get, and I'm not even going to say in the Democratic Party because he's not in the Democratic Party, he's a socialist and he just caucuses with the Democrats. But Sanders has a different viewpoint on gun legislation, which is what some people think is going to give him a problem once he gets into more of the general primaries. Clinton is going to paint him as a gun advocate. And it's partially true, but don't let it totally fool you. There are very specific reasons for why Sanders has voted the way he has in many of the gun control bills. And I'm going to go through those now. Now, one of the number one things that opponents of Sanders are going to point out is that he voted against the Brady Bill from 1990 to 1993 when he was in the House in all the forms that the Brady Bill took, because it kept going to the Senate and then back to the House with modifications. He voted against it pretty much every single time. But there were two main reasons why. One, he's not against gun control, he's against federal gun control. He thinks it should be left up to the states to determine their own gun laws. So he wasn't against the idea of banning certain weapons or controlling them, he just thought it should be left to the states. And secondly, he felt he should also represent his constituents from his district. And he comes from Vermont, which is a very gun-friendly state. There's a lot of hunting there. It's a big part of their economy. It's a big part of their culture. So whether or not he believed in gun control, he felt he should accurately represent the people who sent him there. Now that is a huge debate, and a worthy debate to have, about whether or not once you're in Congress and in a position of power, should you do what you consider the right thing, or do the thing that the people who sent you there want you to do, even if you believe it's the wrong thing. That's a whole separate video. But Sanders in 1994 did vote to ban semi-automatic weapons, and that went through. And then he voted against its repeal in 96, which unfortunately failed, and the ban was repealed. He also voted against the idea of one state's conceal and carry laws being carried immediately over to the next state without any changes, no matter what that state was. He voted against that idea, but it failed. In 2013, he voted against magazines that hold more than 10 rounds. That failed. And later on that year, he voted once again to ban heavy assault style weapons and high capacity magazines. Failed again. So for the people from the Clinton campaign or from any other campaign that try to paint Bernie Sanders as a gun nut, they're wrong. They're just using very specific votes he made, and they're not giving any context to how those votes got brought up. Sanders is not a gun nut. He's just someone that believes in states' rights in certain cases and also believes in representing his constituents as they see fit. Now this will be interesting in a few weeks when the Democrats have their actual first debate, because really the debate's only going to be between Hillary and Sanders. Nobody else is polling anywhere near these two, and they're the only ones that are going to matter. You're going to have Martin O'Malley on stage, you're going to have Lincoln Chafee, I think, on stage, and you're going to have Jim Webb. So instead of the 17 people you've seen in the Republican debate, there's only going to be 5. And that's going to allow for a lot more debate, a lot more talk back between the candidates, which is going to be a really good thing for getting them to say what they mean and stand up for their beliefs. And I'm personally really looking forward to Sanders doing that. I'm not saying I would vote for him immediately, but I just want to see him get in front of a national audience. He's been marginalized by the media so quickly because he falls under this socialist flag, and they think that that should automatically take him out of the running. But polls continuously show that people like him. When they get to hear him, he gets more and more support. As I've mentioned before, he has drawn bigger crowds than every other candidate, some of them combined. And if you want to talk about what the Republicans are doing in terms of the anti-establishment movement that they're doing, the fact that Trump, Carson, and Fiorina are at the top of the polls, Sanders is about as anti-establishment as you're gonna get from the left. So let's see what happens. Which brings me to the question for this week. What do you think of these gun control proposals? Not as a whole package. Don't think of it as just gun control, but what do you think of each one of those? Is there a particular one that you like or dislike? Are there ones that you think should absolutely go through and ones you think shouldn't? Go ahead and let me know in the comments down below. Now, thanks again for watching another episode of the Motley Stew Show. If you haven't subscribed to it yet, you can subscribe to it here. And also, if you haven't already noticed, I've been shooting daily vlogs, so you can subscribe to those here. You can also like, favorite, or share this video with anyone you think might want to join in the discussion. Stay tuned for next week, and as always, here's a little bit of Logan or Liam.
It's your hair time. It's your hair time. Are you gonna give it to mommy?
It's my hair
Okay,
time?
let's blow it at daddy. Ready?
You again.
Okay, I'm gonna blow it at you.
No.
Oh.
Mom got lightheaded. John Boehner realized that stripping the Planned Parenthood funding was not going to work. It was never going to get past the Senate, and it wouldn't get past the president. And at those times, it feels like all the progress and all the work that I've done over the last 2 years on myself is suddenly just wiped away.